January 15, 1942. A rubber plantation outside Bakri, Malaya. Corporal Arthur Webb of the 13th Australian Anti-Tank Battery lays prone behind his rifle. Not the Enfield he trained with. Something bigger. Much bigger. Through the palm oil smoke, Japanese Type 95 Hago tanks materialize. 13 tons of riveted steel. Crew of 3. Advancing at walking pace down the narrow plantation road. Webb presses his shoulder into the padded butt. Lines up the offset front sight. The crosshair settles on the lead tank's hull. He exhales. The boy's rifle roars. The sound is less gunshot and more artillery piece, a percussion wave that flattens jungle grass in a 3-meter radius. The recoil slams Webb backward despite 35 pounds of weapon mass and a spring-loaded barrel. His shoulder feels like it's been kicked by a mule wearing steel boots. Downrange, a spark. Then nothing. The tank keeps coming. Webb works the bolt. 5-round magazine. 4 left. He fires again. And again. On the third hit, smoke pours from the tank's engine grill. The Hago lurches sideways, track shredded, crew bailing out into concentrated rifle fire. When the smoke cleared, the 13th Battery had knocked out 10 Japanese tanks. But Webb's shoulder was purple from collarbone to bicep. The rifle that saved his life had also hospitalized 3 men in his section with cracked collarbones and sprained wrists. The Australians had a new name for their British-issued anti-tank rifle. They called it Charlie the Bastard. This is the story of the weapon nobody wanted to fire, but everybody needed. December 1941. The Empire of Japan exploded across Southeast Asia with a speed that made Blitzkrieg look cautious. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila surrendered January 2nd. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, would capitulate February 15th. And Australian forces found themselves facing an enemy they'd never anticipated fighting, with equipment designed for a war they'd never imagined. The 8th Division AIF deployed to Malaya expecting to garrison rubber plantations and tin mines. Instead, they faced the Imperial Japanese Army's 25th Army, 3 full divisions backed by armor, artillery, and air superiority. The Japanese had spent 5 years perfecting mobile warfare in China. The Australians had spent 5 months digging trenches. The tactical situation was catastrophic. Japanese tactics centered on speed, infiltration, and aggressive use of light armor. Their Type 95 Hago light tanks, while primitive by European standards, were perfectly suited to jungle warfare. 12 millimeters of frontal armor. Enough to deflect rifle fire. Fast enough to exploit breakthroughs. Light enough to use logging roads that couldn't support heavier British tanks. Australian infantry battalions watched these steel coffins roll past their positions unopposed. The standard Enfield .303 rifle? Useless. The Bren gun? Might as well throw stones. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun was effective, when you could manhandle its 1,800-pound weight through swamp and jungle, which meant it stayed on the roads, where Japanese infiltrators could bypass it. The boy's rifle was the infantry's only man-portable answer, and man-portable was doing heavy lifting. Each Australian infantry battalion received a dozen boys' rifles on establishment. That meant 12 rifles to defend against armor across a frontage that could stretch 5 miles. The 219th Battalion's war diary recorded the mathematics coldly. Enemy tanks penetrated company position at 1,430 hours. No anti-tank weapons available. Withdrew under pressure. In the Owen Stanley Mountains of New Guinea, the equation got worse. Try carrying a 36-pound rifle up a 60-degree mud slope. Through waist-deep mud. While Japanese snipers fire from positions you can't see. The boys became what soldiers call a fair-weather weapon, useful when conditions were perfect, useless when they weren't. Which was most of the time. But understanding why the boys failed in Australian service means understanding where it came from. And why Britain thought it would work in the first place. The anti-tank rifle occupied a peculiar niche in military doctrine, weapons designed to kill tanks from distances tanks couldn't return fire. Theoretically brilliant. Practically problematic. The British Army of 1937 looked at tank development and saw armor thickness averaging 15 to 20 millimeters. The Germans were fielding Panzer Is and TUS, glorified tin cans with machine guns. The Italian CVE 33 Tankette had armor you could penetrate with a .50 caliber machine gun if you hit the right spot. Anti-tank rifles made sense. By 1941, that calculus had changed completely. The German Panzer III mounted 50 mm of frontal armor. The Panzer IV? 80 mm. Even the obsolete Panzer II had been up-armored to 35 mm in critical areas. The boys' rifle's 23 mm penetration at 100 yards was suddenly medieval. But in the Pacific Theater, Australian forces weren't facing panzer divisions. They were facing Japanese light armor that the British War Office hadn't even known existed when they designed the boys. The Type 95 Hago light tank mounted 12 mm of frontal armor at 65 degrees. Side armor? 11 mm vertical. The boys could penetrate that at 300 yards. Should have been perfect. It wasn't. The rifle's effective range of 500 yards was theoretical. Combat range was under 200. In jungle terrain with 30-meter visibility, you were lucky to spot a tank at 50 yards, which meant the tank crew had also spotted you. Japanese tank doctrine emphasized infantry cooperation. Every Hago traveled with a squad of riflemen specifically trained to hunt anti-tank weapons. The boys required a two-man crew minimum. Gunner and loader. Ideally 3. Add a spotter. That's 3 infantrymen who couldn't maneuver quickly, couldn't take cover effectively, and announce their position with a muzzle blast that could be heard a mile away. Weight was the killer. At 36 pounds unloaded, the boys weighed more than 2 Lee Enfield rifles with full ammunition loads. The 5-round magazine weighed 3 pounds. Typical combat load was 3 magazines, 15 rounds total. That's 45 pounds of rifle and ammunition before you add water, rations, medical kit, or anything else. Compare that to the Japanese Type 97 20mm anti-tank rifle, 29 pounds. Still brutal, but 30% lighter. The Finnish Lotti L-39, 49 pounds, but could defeat 30 mm of armor at 100 meters. The German Panzerbuchs 39, 28 pounds. The boys was heavier than its contemporaries, with less penetration than comparable weapons. Then came the recoil. The manual stated clearly, prolonged firing will cause physical injury to the firer. Not might cause, will cause. The barrel recoiled backward in its cradle to absorb energy. The butt was padded with rubber and canvas. The weapon had a muzzle brake to redirect gases. Despite all this, firing the boys felt like being hit with a baseball bat swung by someone who meant it. Medical reports from Australian battalions in Malaya documented the injuries. Fractured clavicles, dislocated shoulders, sprained wrists, cracked ribs from improper firing positions. The 230th Battalion's medical officer wrote in March 1942. 3 men evacuated with injuries sustained from own anti-tank rifle. Combat effectiveness of boys' rifle section reduced 40% due to accumulated injuries and reluctance of personnel to engage targets. Reluctance. That's the word that appears again and again in after-action reports. Soldiers who would charge machine gun nests with bayonets were reluctant to fire their own anti-tank weapon. And into this problematic weapon system marched Australian infantry, told this was their primary defense against armor. Captain Henry Charles Boys never saw the weapon that bore his name enter service. Born in 1885, Boys joined the British Small Arms Committee in the early 1930s as Assistant Superintendent of Design. He was a career ordnance engineer, the sort of man who understood metallurgy and ballistics the way poets understand meter and rhyme. By 1936, he was senior designer at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock. That year, Britain's military planners finally acknowledged what everyone else had known for 5 years. Tanks were the future of warfare, and infantry needed a way to kill them. The War Office requirements were specific. Man-portable. Effective against 20 mm of armor at reasonable combat ranges. Capable of being fired from a bipod without requiring fixed emplacements. Weight not to exceed 40 pounds. Bolt action for reliability. Magazine fed for sustainable rate of fire. Boys drew inspiration from Polish anti-tank rifle designs captured during intelligence operations. But where the Polish WZ.35 used a complex semi-automatic action, boys opted for simplicity. Bolt action. 5-round detachable box magazine mounted on top. Barrel free to recoil in its cradle. Muzzle brake to reduce recoil. Padded butt stock to reduce injury. The caliber was .55 inches, 13.9 millimeters. Not because it was optimal, but because Britain had machinery to produce .50 caliber cases. Add a slight expansion to fit the larger projectile, and you had a cartridge you could manufacture without retooling entire factories. The projectile was a 930-grain armor-piercing round with a hardened steel core, lead sleeve, and steel jacket. Muzzle velocity of 747 meters per second. At 100 yards, it could penetrate 23 millimeters of armor plate at 30 degrees obliquity. Against the German Panzer II, that was lethal. Against the face-hardened armor of later tanks, it was inadequate. Boys completed the design in early 1937. Trials began in March. The rifle performed exactly as designed, which was to say, it worked, but nobody enjoyed using it. On April 15, 1937, Captain Henry Boys died suddenly. Heart failure. He was 52 years old. The War Office, in a gesture that was either touching tribute or bureaucratic convenience, renamed the rifle from its original designation, stanchion, to Boys in his honor. 3 months later, in November 1937, the rifle, anti-tank, .55 in, Boys was officially adopted into British service. Orders went to BSA in Birmingham and the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Production began immediately. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Britain had manufactured roughly 15,000 Boys rifles. By war's end, the number would exceed 62,000. Australia received its first shipment in late 1940. The second AIF units deploying to the Middle East were issued Boys rifles on a scale of 12 per battalion. Most soldiers had never seen one. Many wouldn't survive long enough to learn whether they worked. Technical breakdown. The Boys Mark I measured 63.5 inches overall. Barrel length 36 inches. Weight 36 pounds unloaded. Add a 5-round magazine and you were looking at 39 pounds. That's 39 pounds of precision-engineered complexity. The action was bolt-operated, rotating bolt with front-locking lugs. 7-groove rifling, right-hand twist. The bolt handle curved forward, unusual, but it kept the operation compact. Cycling the action required strength. This wasn't the smooth throw of a Lee Enfield. This was industrial machinery. The barrel was the clever part. It wasn't fixed. It rode in a cradle attached to the receiver, free to recoil backward 3/8 of an inch when fired. A powerful spring absorbed the energy, then returned the barrel to battery. Combined with the muzzle brake, a circular, 6-port design that vented gases radially, this reduced felt recoil to merely punishing instead of weapon-destroying. The muzzle brake itself was distinctive. Early Mark I rifles featured a circular brake with a T-shaped monopod. The Mark I * variant, built primarily by John Inglis Company in Canada, used a rectangular 4-port brake and a V-shaped bipod. The changes improved manufacturability without affecting performance. The magazine sat on top of the receiver, offset to the right. 5 rounds in a detachable box. Why top-mounted? Gravity. In mud, in water, in jungle humidity, a top-mounted magazine would feed more reliably than side or bottom magazines. The theory was sound. In practice, the magazine's weight threw off the rifle's balance, making it awkward to carry. Sights were simple. An open rear notch adjustable for 300, 500, and 700 yards. An offset front post, offset to clear the muzzle brake. In theory, these graduations allowed precise engagement at extended ranges. In combat, most engagements happened at under 100 yards, where the sights were largely irrelevant. The buttstock was the rifle's most obvious feature. 12 inches of padded alloy shoulder piece with a pistol grip. Canvas butt pad. An oil bottle fitted into a compartment in the stock, essential, because the boys needed constant cleaning to function. The padding made the rifle tolerable to fire. Without it, the boys would have broken shoulders. The bipod attached at the rifle center of balance, just forward of the trigger group. Adjustable height. Sturdy enough to support the weapon's mass. In practice, Australian soldiers often removed the bipod to save weight, then regretted it when they needed to fire the weapon. Ammunition came in two types. The W Mark I featured a 60-gram steel core armor-piercing projectile at 747 meters per second. Effective, but by 1942, marginal against improved armor. The W Mark II, introduced in 1942, used a tungsten core, 47.6 grams at 884 meters per second. The lighter projectile achieved higher velocity, improving penetration to approximately 20 millimeters at 70 degrees obliquity. The problem was availability. Tungsten was scarce. Most Australian units in the Pacific never saw W Mark II ammunition. There were variants. The Mark II airborne version featured a shortened 30-inch barrel and weighed 31 pounds. Designed for paratroopers. The reduced barrel length increased muzzle blast and recoil to levels described in period reports as unacceptable. Few were produced. Even fewer were used operationally. Manufacturing quality varied. BSA rifles from 1938 were excellent. Precision machined, tight tolerances. Wartime production rifles from 1940 to 1941 showed corner cutting. Parts didn't always interchange between manufacturers. Magazines from Enfield sometimes wouldn't fit BSA receivers. In the field, this was a nightmare. The boys required maintenance that jungle warfare made difficult. The receiver had to be cleaned daily. The barrel needed oiling after every firing session. The recoil spring would weaken with prolonged exposure to heat and humidity, which described every day in New Guinea. Australian armorers reported chronic issues with feed reliability in rifles that had seen extended jungle service. This was the weapon Australian infantry carried into the Pacific. Engineering impressive. Execution problematic. Results mixed. Now, if you're finding this level of detail interesting, consider subscribing. We're building something here for people who actually care about the engineering, the history, and the human stories behind Australian military equipment. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps us keep digging into the weapons and conflicts that shape this nation. Hit that button. Let's keep going. The boys' anti-tank rifles' first test in Australian service came at precisely the wrong place and time. January 18, 1942. The Gemencheh Bridge ambush, Malaya. The 230th Battalion, supported by the 13th Australian Anti-Tank Battery, established positions along both sides of a jungle road. Japanese Imperial Guards Division armor, 13 Type 95 Hago tanks, approached in column formation. Perfect ambush terrain. The kind of engagement boys' rifle doctrine was written for. The results were spectacular. Gunners of the 13th Battery knocked out 10 tanks in 17 minutes. The Australian War Memorial's official history records it as the most successful anti-tank action by Australian forces in Malaya. Penetrating shots through side armor. Engine compartment hits causing fires. Track mobility kills. But read deeper into unit diaries, and a different picture emerges. Of the 48 rounds fired, 31 missed. Hit probability of 35%. Every gunner who fired more than 3 rounds sustained injuries ranging from bruised shoulders to fractured clavicles. 2 rifles suffered cracked stocks from recoil stress. 1 weapon was abandoned when its magazine jammed and couldn't be cleared under fire. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, commander of the boys' rifle section, wrote in his after-action report, "Weapon effective against Japanese light armor when conditions permit careful shot placement. Recommend reducing magazine capacity to 3 rounds to limit cumulative recoil injuries. Further recommend reassignment of younger, heavier personnel to boys' sections." Translation: the rifle worked, but it hurt the soldiers more than they could tolerate. Similar stories repeated across the Pacific theater. At Milne Bay in August 1942, Australian infantry faced Japanese tanks in darkness and rain. The 2 and 10th Battalion's Boys Rifle Section engaged enemy armor at ranges under 50 yards. Results were mixed, some penetrations, some deflections, and one rifle whose barrel became so fouled with mud that it burst on firing, wounding both crew members. Private Colin Morris, 29th Battalion, recounted years later, "You fired once, maybe twice if you were keen. Then you grabbed your rifle and got out of there, because every Jap in the sector knew exactly where you were. That muzzle flash looked like a bloody volcano erupting. The noise, Christ, the noise. My ears rang for 3 days after Milne Bay." The weapon's reputation evolved as the war progressed. In North Africa, where Australian units engaged German and Italian armor at longer ranges across open terrain, the boys performed adequately. In the jungle warfare of the Pacific, it was problematic. Unit commanders began reassigning boys' rifles. Instead of dedicated anti-tank use, they became bunker-busting weapons. The heavy .55 caliber round could penetrate palm logs and coral fortifications that .303 rounds couldn't touch. Against Japanese pillboxes at Buna and Gunna, boys' rifles proved unexpectedly valuable. Sergeant James "Bluey" Parker, 216th Battalion, wrote home in November 1942, "That elephant gun is useless against tanks in the jungle, can't see the buggers until they're on top of you. But put a boys' round into a Jap bunker and watch the whole bloody thing disintegrate." We started carrying it for that instead. This wasn't official doctrine. This was field innovation born from frustration. But as 1943 progressed, Japanese armor largely disappeared from the Pacific theater. Logistics couldn't support tank operations in island campaigns. The Hago became a curiosity rather than a threat, and the boys' rifle became increasingly irrelevant. By mid-1943, Australian battalions were receiving the PIAT, projector, infantry, anti-tank. It was clumsy, temperamental, and had a tendency to injure users almost as badly as the boys. But it weighed 34 pounds instead of 36, could fire from cover, and didn't require exposing your position with every shot. Boys' rifles began disappearing from unit inventories. Not through official channels, through creative loss reports. Lost during river crossing. Destroyed by enemy action. Buried with battle casualties. The Australian Army officially withdrew the boys from frontline service in September 1943. Units retained them through 1944 for specialist applications. By 1945, most had been shipped to rear area storage or scrapped. Total boys' anti-tank rifles issued to Australian forces, approximately 3,000. Confirmed tank kills in Australian service, approximately 40 to 60, records are incomplete. Personnel injuries from firing the weapon, hundreds, conservatively. The boys' rifle's strategic impact on Australian operations wasn't in tanks destroyed, it was in psychological reassurance during a period when reassurance was desperately needed. From January to March 1942, Australian forces retreated continuously. Singapore fell. Burma fell. The Japanese landed on New Guinea. Every defensive position was outflanked. Every withdrawal became a rout. Infantry needed to believe they had tools to stop Japanese armor, even if those tools were marginal. The presence of boys' rifles in sections provided that belief. Medical reports show soldiers were more willing to hold positions when they believed they had anti-tank capability, even if that capability was one 36-pound rifle with 15 rounds. The psychological effect on Japanese forces was minimal. Intelligence assessments from captured documents make no specific mention of boys' rifles as a threat concern. Japanese tactics didn't adapt to account for anti-tank rifle positions the way they adapted to anti-tank gun emplacements. Where the boys mattered was in validating Australian tactical doctrine. The ambush at Gemencheh Bridge proved that properly positioned anti-tank weapons could stop Japanese armor. This emboldened later defensive stands. The Battle of Milne Bay, Japan's first land defeat, succeeded partially because Australian commanders trusted their anti-tank capabilities enough to hold ground rather than retreat. That trust might have been misplaced technically, but it was strategically significant. Post-war analysis concluded that the boys' rifle was obsolete by 1941, ineffective against German armor by 1942, and marginally useful in the Pacific throughout the war. But obsolete doesn't mean useless. In the absence of better options, marginal capability beats no capability. Production and service life. The Boys anti-tank rifle entered production in late 1937 at two facilities: the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield and Birmingham Small Arms Company in Birmingham. Total British production through 1940. Approximately 45,000 rifles. In 1940, production expanded to Canada. John Inglis and Company in Toronto manufactured the Mark I** variant, rectangular muzzle brake, V-bipod, simplified sights. Canadian production added 17,000 rifles before ceasing in 1943. Total production across all manufacturers, approximately 62,000 rifles. Cost per unit in 1939, approximately £45, roughly equivalent to 2 months' wages for a skilled factory worker. Compared to a Lee Enfield rifle at £4, the Boys represented significant investment. Australia never manufactured Boys rifles domestically. All weapons were imported from British or Canadian production. First shipments arrived in November 1940. Distribution prioritized units deploying overseas. The 6th Division AIF received Boys rifles before deploying to North Africa. The 8th Division received them before Malaya. The 7th Division received them piecemeal as they redeployed from the Middle East to the Pacific. By 1943, British production had ceased. The PIAT had replaced the Boys in British service. Canada stopped manufacturing in March 1943. Australia's supply became finite. No replacements for rifles lost, damaged, or destroyed. The Australian Army formally retired the Boys from infantry battalion establishments in September 1943. Remaining rifles were consolidated at ordnance depots. Some were issued to Australian New Guinea administrative unit patrols operating in remote areas. Some went to Papua New Guinea infantry battalions as bunker-busting weapons. A handful saw service in the Korean War. Australian patrols operating in mountainous terrain found the Boys useful for engaging enemy positions at extended ranges. Reports are fragmentary, but at least one platoon from 3 RAR carried a Boys rifle as a designated marksman weapon through early 1951. By the mid-1950s, remaining serviceable rifles were sold as surplus or destroyed. The Australian War Memorial Collection includes 5 Boys rifles, 3 Mark I, 2 Mark I Star. Condition ranges from fair to excellent. Today, functioning Boys rifles are rare. Most were destroyed during post-war scrapping programs. Those that survive are typically rendered inert, demilitarized to prevent firing. Complete rifles in firing condition command prices exceeding $20,000 in collector markets. Several museums worldwide maintain operational examples for demonstration purposes. The Royal Armouries in Leeds fires their Mark I annually. The Australian Armour and Artillery Museum maintains a Mark I asterisk in firing condition, though ammunition availability limits demonstrations. The Boys anti-tank rifle represents the last generation of man-portable kinetic anti-tank weapons before shape-charge warheads made the concept obsolete. Its direct descendants were few. The British PIAT used a completely different mechanism. The American M9A1 bazooka, the German Panzerschreck, the Soviet RPG-2, all used explosive projectiles rather than kinetic penetrators. But the Boys established doctrine that survived. The concept of infantry portable anti-tank weapons distributed at battalion level. The two-man crew structure. The emphasis on ambush tactics rather than direct assault. These principles carried through to modern anti-tank guided missile systems. Military historian Dr. Peter Stanley notes, the Boys rifle failed not because it was poorly designed, but because its design assumptions became obsolete faster than anyone predicted. Against the armor of 1937, it was lethal. Against the armor of 1942, it was marginal. But it established organizational structures and tactical doctrines that shaped Australian anti-armor capabilities for decades. Modern Australian infantry sections no longer carry dedicated anti-tank weapons. The Carl Gustav recoilless rifle fills that role at company level. But the institutional memory of the Boys, the understanding that infantry needs options against armor, remains embedded in doctrine. In popular culture, The boy's rifle appears occasionally in films and video games set in World War II. Usually inaccurately. The 2019 game Battlefield 5 features the boys as a sniper rifle, which is technically absurd but reflects its visual impression on modern audiences. Among firearms collectors and historians, the boys occupies a peculiar niche. Too heavy and specialized to be practical. Too historically significant to ignore. Too painful to fire recreationally. It's a museum piece that occasionally roars back to life when ammunition can be sourced. The Australian Army's official historian wrote in 1963, "The boy's rifle was unpopular, uncomfortable, and arguably obsolete before it reached frontline service. It nevertheless provided Australian infantry with anti-tank capability at a time when no alternatives existed. For that alone, it deserves recognition." 63.5 inches of steel and frustration. 36 pounds of engineering compromise. A 5-round magazine nobody wanted to empty. This was the rifle that broke shoulders and stopped tanks. This was the rifle soldiers nicknamed Charlie the Bastard and Elephant Gun, names that spoke of grudging respect and profound discomfort. This was the rifle that fired once like artillery and kicked like a mule, announcing its position to every enemy soldier within a mile. The Japanese had light tanks with paper-thin armor. The Germans had panzers with face-hardened plate. The British had doctrine written for a war that never came. Australia had the boys. And in the jungles of Malaya, the swamps of Milne Bay, and the mountains of New Guinea, that made the difference between holding ground and retreating into the sea. It was never the weapon anyone wanted. But for 2 desperate years, it was the weapon they had. And sometimes, in war, that's enough.